Okay, I just wanted to give you some brief reasons why I've got some concerns about some of the reported testing for coronavirus. Because I know there's been so much worry about it, and we're hearing daily reports of many deaths in different parts of the world and increases in those various levels of deaths. But why are there some concerns about the reporting? I'm just going to go on to briefly a concise account of some of those concerns. According to the ISS, who are the Italian Institute of Health, up to 99.2% of all alleged COVID-19 deaths could have been caused by pre-existing health conditions. That's 99.2%, so the overwhelming majority. In fact, the ISS, they report that of those reported to die with COVID-19, the medium age of those was 80 years, a little over 80 years and 5 months, actually. 10% of the deceased were over 90 years of age. 90% were over 70. 75% of the deceased had two or more pre-existing conditions. Over half of them, 50%, had three or more serious conditions. Only 5 of the deceased, aged between 31 and 39, but all with pre-existing serious health conditions. I think they also claimed that the test results can also produce false negatives or false positives, even. And the reports coming from China that I read recently, the gentleman there, he tested positive, then negative, then positive again, and did the same result on the same person, and different test results produced different results. The Italian study found that up to 75% of positive test results were entirely symptomless. And of 2,978 deaths, only 24 of those died with serious pre-existing conditions. So what's quite clear, according to the ISS reports, the Italian Institute of Health, that is, their reports make it abundantly clear that the overwhelming majority of people seem to have very serious health conditions, pre-existing health conditions indeed, as well as the corona. So we're not sure if it is in fact the corona that contributed to that, or whether they already would have died of those serious health conditions. So the overwhelming majority were either very elderly, or had those health conditions. There was a Japanese research study that found the mortality rate to be as low as 0.04%. But I know that the mortality rates are being seriously disputed, and there are wildly differing reports according to the different samples of the public that are being studied and how representative those are. The registered deaths in England and Wales for the week ending the 6th of March was 10,895. The average for that week over the previous 5 years was 11,498. So up until that point of the first week of March, a few weeks ago, the mortality rate had in fact slightly decreased. Of course, that's before corona was allegedly to be spreading in more excessive numbers. So it'll be more interesting, I think, to see what the later death figures will be, and to see how accurate those are. In fact, comparatively, the European Mortality Bulletin, who produce weekly reports, their week 11 report that came out on the 6th of March 2020 stated that pooled estimates of all-cause mortality showed normal expected mortality in the participating countries. So again, up to the point of the first week of March, there were slightly decreased overall levels of mortality rates. But are those reports that are coming in about the estimated numbers of those dying with coronavirus, are they accurate indeed? That's something to sort of really seriously to seriously look into and to consider. Because actually, there's been some advice nowadays, more recently, that's been giving out to doctors, that they don't have to put on the death certificate now a corona diagnosis if they've got a positive test result. They can do it just because they've assumed or they presume that it might be coronavirus or COVID-19, that strain of coronavirus. So it's now a presumption that can lead to a diagnosis and a death certificate record. And they've now changed the legislation so that a second doctor doesn't have to oversee and check that out. So that can just be done with one doctor's presumption alone now. And that's according from recent government advice given out to doctors. That a presumption alone, without any positive tests whatsoever, that can lead to a diagnosis and a death certificate recording of a corona death. Even the mere presumption of it. But of course, the symptoms of it are actually quite similar to many other respiratory infectious diseases. So one would wonder how accurate that kind of presumptive recording might be. Dr. John Lee, who's a professor of pathology, wrote in his column for The Spectator recently, many UK health spokespersons have been careful to repeatedly say that the number quoted in the UK indicate the death with the virus and not the death due to the virus. Going on to state that many and the overwhelming majority of those patients recorded to die of coronavirus had many other pre-existing health conditions. And it was stated in a BBC article, what the figures do not tell us is to what extent the virus is causing the death. It could be the major cause, a contributor factor, or simply present when they are dying of something else. In a BBC article, an 18-year-old in Coventry tested positive for coronavirus the day before he died and was reported as its youngest victim at the time. But the hospital subsequently released a statement saying that the death had been due to a separate, significant health condition and not connected to the virus. On March the 24th, the hospital issued this statement. Yet despite this, some tabloid papers were still referring to it as the coronavirus death a week later, March the 31st. So we've got here a report of somebody dying of coronavirus, when in actual fact the hospital itself had come out to state quite clearly that he had a serious health condition that was causing him to die anyway. And you wonder how many other reports there are of that nature. So it's quite hard to know. Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg estimated that the coronavirus normally makes up 7 to 15% of acute respiratory diseases. Normally 7 to 15% of viruses are coronaviruses, and that's each year. So Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg was really saying that deaths due to coronavirus are an essential fabric of the general nature of viruses in general anyway. And you would find a certain proportion each year of that. But of course, we're talking about a new strain of the coronaviruses. But we'll have to look to see how accurate those figures are and what numbers they actually get to. In the USA, a briefing note from the CDC, the CDC's National Vital Statistics Service, it read out guidance as COVID-19 should be reported for all deceased where the disease caused or is presumed to have caused or contributed to the death. The CDC's National Vital Statistics Service gave out that advice on April the 3rd, 2020. Well, their advice is that it could just be that it's been presumed. Again, the same advice that's being given out by the UK government to doctors here, that a presumption of COVID-19 is sufficient enough to have a firm diagnosis. And that would contribute towards the statistics of that without any necessary need, therefore, for any testing. So how many deaths are being presumed and reported on the basis of a presumption rather than a positive test? So So it's really worth considering those issues, I think, because if we're going to base, our daily activities and extreme measures like shutdowns and self-isolationism, then we want to have that justified by clear evidence. And I think it's worthwhile examining that and how accurate are those testings. And I've got my concerns about that, but I'm going to investigate those matters a lot more fully. And I would really hope other people would, because any kind of extreme measures needs to be justified and looked at. And actual fact, it really appears from what I've looked at so far that really the infection is no more dangerous than influenza. But in fact, influenza itself and other infectious diseases are dangerous to an extent. They killed hundreds of thousands. But we need to look at the context without that. Statistics are quite meaningless without looking at the overall context we're looking at that within. If you look at tests for random samples in the population. In Germany, South Korea, and Iceland, some studies revealed that the mortality rates they estimated at 0.37%, 0.6%, and 0.4% respectively. Dr. John Ioannidis, I think, from Stanford University, estimates 0.025 up to 0.65%, and a Japanese study estimated between 0.04 and 0.12%. Well, the regular estimates for influenza each year is roughly about 0.1%, as far as I could find out. So those studies of a more random sample of the population would estimate it's comparable to other influenza viral infections. The WHO might have estimated a 3 to 4% death mortality rate, but that was based on clinical studies of those that were already critically ill. So, of course, if you're only studying those of very ill, there's going to be a much higher mortality rate. So I kind of think that we don't probably know the overall figures, and at best they may be rough estimates, but at worst they may have no real basis because there are so many other factors that make them, just false, just because, if you are labeling things as coronavirus when there are other serious health conditions that could have caused it, if you're presuming that it could be coronavirus because of merely the symptoms seem similar to that when they could easily be other infectious diseases that have got such similar symptoms. And if you also have many possible false positive test results from those tests, and also if the tests itself are not widespread, many people are not able to get access to those, so we're not able to sort of know. So when you consider all of those factors together, it makes you consider actually how accurate any of these statistics are. Well, actually, we're hearing daily reports of deaths from people dying. Thousands of people die each day of influenza, of course. So we need to keep that in proportion. And what we need to be comparing is the current numbers of people that are dying reported compared to the current numbers that would have died over the days, weeks, and months in different regions and globally of influenza in general and other respiratory infectious diseases too. And comparing those statistics and looking at proportions of those. In actual fact, whatever the deaths are, over 1,500 people on average, roughly, will die each day in the UK. So, there are large amounts of people that die, and that's sad for those individuals personally involved. We know it can be heartbreaking. On a more positive note, over half, 1,500 people will be born each day. It depends how you choose to look at it, but you need to look at the overall figures, which are huge. The overall context is quite hard sometimes to determine because we're talking about really giant figures sometimes. So just looking at, deaths each day, as moving and as emotional they are for the individuals, they're meaningless unless we consider whether those are a result of more general infectious diseases, and how those statistics align according to the yearly averages of different regions and global ones, and whether those are in line with what those averages are over the last few years. And that's the kind of information that we need to sort of be looking for.